Well, I will start with the introductions. Hello, everyone. I am so delighted to welcome you to a briefing about the Bipartisan Nonprofit Sector Strength and Partnership Act in the U.S. House of Representatives, introduced by Representative Fred Upton in Michigan and Minnesota's very own Representative Betty McCollum. This event is co-hosted by our friends at the Minnesota Council on Foundations, and we also want to give a shout out to our friends at the independent sector for their instrumental work in moving this legislation forward. Thank you so much for being here with us today. My name is Nonoko Sato. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Executive Director for the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits. Before we start, I want to first acknowledge and honor the history of the land that we are on. Minnesota Makoche, the land where the waters reflect the clouds, was violently taken from the Dakota, Anishinaabe, and numerous other indigenous peoples who have made innumerable contributions to our state. A land acknowledgement alone does not rectify the historical trauma of colonialism and violence. As we affirm tribal sovereignty, we all need to hold ourselves accountable to protect and honor the history and work to counter systemic injustices that continue to harm indigenous people. To learn more about the land that you are on, please visit native-land.ca. Just to lay out the agenda for the next hour, we will first hear from Representative McCollum about the new federal legislation. MCF will then moderate a Q&A with our team in the independent sector. Please feel free to add your own questions in the chat anytime. We have team members reviewing them throughout our time together. You are all here because you are champions of nonprofits and the critical services we provide to our communities. Our sector is strong. Here in Minnesota, the nonprofit sector makes up almost 14% of our workforce and generates over $66 billion in annual revenue. Over the past 2 years alone, nonprofits have risen to the needs of the moment, and as demands for services continue to increase, we were largely left behind on relief funding due to confusing applications, inability to accept loans, or simply did not have the required banking partner to process funding. Many of us here are familiar with the challenges of having to be an expert in everything, pushed to do more with less, asked to solve complex social issues, and ensure we are transparent and accountable to our public. It is challenging to work with decision makers who simply do not understand how nonprofits operate and the day-to-day hurdles we face simply to make payroll next month. These are some of the reasons why it is vital for our sector have a seat at the table. Our voice matters, and we are grateful for Representative McCollum for her continued advocacy and partnership as champion of nonprofits. The legislation she and Representative Upton introduced last month is aimed at strengthening the nonprofit sector and its relationship with the federal government. The legislation will improve access to data about the nonprofit sector and leverage the mission, knowledge, and impact of thousands of nonprofits to work together more effectively in pursuit of shared goals. Representative McCollum represents the 4th Congressional District in Minnesota, which covers St. Paul, all of Ramsey County, and most of Washington County. She graduated from the College of St. Catherine, and before Congress, she served in the Minnesota House of Representatives from 1993 to 2000, and was the assistant leader elected 3 times by her colleagues. She also served in the North St. Paul City Council and has also taught high school social science. She's a chair of the Appropriations Subcommittee on Defense and is a vice chair of the Interior Environmental Appropriations Subcommittee, where she prioritizes investments in Indian country and protecting our clean air and water, wilderness and public lands, and our nation's natural treasures. She's also a member of the House Natural Resources Committee. Last but certainly not least, Representative McCollum is a mother of 2 adult children and lives in St. Paul. Without further ado, please give a warm virtual welcome to Representative Betty McCollum. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. So we're gathered here today, and I do mean it when I say thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction. Thank all of you for being here, and thank all of you for being such strong advocates for the nonprofits and philanthropic societies. So the last 2 years, our country faced unprecedented global pandemic. And it exposed disparities that many of you work on, but it exposed them right in front center. Disparities on healthcare, disparities on education, disparities on housing. In other words, systemic racism and the way it impacts our daily lives and impacts some of our neighbors in ways we can only begin to imagine. So by shining this light on what we're facing, it gives your sector an important role in our nation's recovery. So as we in the federal government work to respond to the devastation of the COVID-19 pandemic, we rely heavily on the nonprofit sector to carry out the essential frontline services to communities, including our federal relief programs. Programs like what was mentioned before, the Paycheck Protection Program. So with many nonprofit staff positions having higher exposure risks, you had to make some tough decisions. You had to limit your flexibility in your work locations and in your hours. And I know, being on the front line, you're facing burnout. So let's face it, the nonprofit sector was hit hard. Yet the demand for your vital services that you provide has just gone up more and more. In Minnesota, we have a long legacy of a strong nonprofit sector. Our esteemed host, the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits and the Minnesota Council on Foundations, are one of the largest and strongest state organizations in the nation. Congratulations to all of you. And it's been my good fortune to work alongside of you for over 20 years. And if I add the House years, even longer than that. Ranging from the multi-billion-dollar Mayo Clinic to the small human service-based organizations in the Northwest regions of the state, nonprofit organizations truly are the backbone of our economy. You keep our economy working, and you keep our way of life here in Minnesota protected. Now, I'm inspired by the spirit of giving in Minnesota, having grown up here. So my bill, the Nonprofit Sector Strength and Partnership Act, is the beginning of a new positive partnership act. It is the beginning of a conversation about the nonprofit sector in Washington and across our nation. This legislation will create a White House Office on Nonprofit Sector Partnerships with the purpose to identify and promote policies that increase and sustain charitable giving, volunteerism, and yes, national service. All the while working to simplify, expedite, and streamline federal government contracting and granting processes with the sector. This legislation will also establish an Interagency Council on Nonprofit Sector Partnerships, which is tasked with issuing biannual reports, providing recommendations, seeing how the sector can best leverage and accelerate federal investments to build and reinvest in our American communities and address the issue of national significance. Finally, the Nonprofit Sector Strength and Partnership Act creates an advisory board on the nonprofit sector comprised of nonprofit leaders with diverse backgrounds who will advise the president and the Interagency Council on policy affecting the sector. Main streets across our countries, they're filled with small businesses, foundations, and nonprofits. All of you are vital employers working to keep families and communities strong and successful. And Congress needs to strengthen all of its employers. And that means when we do that, we will be keeping our entire community strong, vibrant, and growing. It's time for Congress to act to give nonprofits a voice in federal policymaking. With the help of my colleague, John Upton from Michigan, another Great Lakes state, the collective leadership of the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits and the Minnesota Council on Foundations, all the incredible support I had from you, all the nurturing, all the mentoring that you did as we put this bill together, makes me hopeful that we can pass it and ensure that nonprofits have a seat at the table in Congress and are included at the seat at the table in the White House. Your voices have to be heard on issues that affect their mission, our federal mission. And so I look forward to working with you and the millions of Americans you employ and all the communities that you serve, because you're what keeps our communities together. So thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. And I'm going to take a couple questions, I understand.
Representative McCollum, thank you so much for those comments and for introducing the bill. I know that we're really excited about it, as is I know Minnesota Council of Nonprofits was particularly instrumental in helping put it together. And we were able to have a number of conversations about it with members of the Minnesota congressional delegation actually earlier this year at Foundations on the Hill. And there seems to be a lot of excitement and interest. So thank you for your work in doing that. I do know that Sophia is going to do kind of a more detailed briefing, but maybe we can see if there's a question or two right now for Representative McCollum, and then we'll move into the more detailed briefing from Sophia. And it looks like we do have a question in the chat, so I'll just.
And if it's real detailed, I'll turn right to Sophia. No, I'm teasing.
Well, the question is, how does the bill guarantee that large and small nonprofits, kind of various size, volunteer-based, employee-based nonprofits are represented in these committees? Is that?
Well, the way it's going to be put together is we're going to make sure there's representation from all of the groups. And I think, you know, to my point about working with the Minnesota groups, I mean, Minnesota can put people forward, other states can put people forward, and then the councils themselves will have a voice at the table on how selection's happening. So this is not going to be a council where, you know, the president just gets to pick who they want on. The president will have their own White House capacity in which to do that. And you know, if it's anybody like President Biden, they'll be turning to you for leadership on who to put on the White House Council. But the Federal Advisory Board is what's the most important part of that. And Sophia can get into it, but it's community-based, and it's to consult with policymakers. And I know you do some of that here in Minnesota, but I think we also need to formalize that. And I'm putting my state representative hat back on to do that, because this is why I'm so passionate about it. I would watch state budgets get cut back. I was under 2 Republican administrations when I served. And at the same time, they would be asking nonprofits to do more. And that they'd ask the foundations to step up to the plate, to do their work. And that's why you have to have a seat at the table, because the funding should come right along with it.
Thanks for that response. Maybe we'll take one more question and then we'll move into Sophia. And it looks like Marie has a great question about where does your passion for nonprofits come from? And obviously we're all very grateful for it.
Well, I grew up in South St. Paul. It was a blue-collar working class town. And at that time, and I see Jane on here, it was filled with immigrants who came to the stockyards, worked at the railroads, worked in the barge communities. These were hardworking people. The Croatian Hall and the Serbian Hall were just blocks from each other, which wouldn't have happened in Europe. I mean, they weren't getting along in Europe, but everybody pitched in together here. And my mother was active in the community. My father worked on historical society issues. You know, libraries were important, and fundraising for libraries. And, you know, I'm still a card-carrying Girl Scout. What can I say? And I know that it was those experiences of people who volunteered in our community, people, and you know, there's somebody that organized the volunteers. You find that out later on, right? Or the seed money to make something happen in a community. And I thought, you know, I've been pretty lucky to experience this, and I want other people to have the same experience, because it just makes my community all the better to live in.
That's really great. Thank you for sharing some of your personal background as well, and history
Yeah.
of nonprofits.
Well, I'm going to let you get on with Sophia. Sophia, they're asking about the Senate companion. I saw that come up in the chat, but I'll let my able co-hosts lead the way on that. And thank you so much. And I'm also going to talk to Sophia about you know, ways we can maybe do things in some of the bills that come on the floor with doing amendments and report language, and just kind of knitting it all together in the whole fabric of the way that we do legislation. But Fred and I are really excited about getting this bill passed as a standalone. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time and your passion and for your work on this bill. We're so appreciative and just really grateful.
Miigwech.
And I think with that, I'll turn it over to Sophia, who is Representative McCollum's lead staffer, who's been working very hard on this bill and knows it inside and out. And she's going to give us a briefing, kind of the details of the bill. I know that Ben Kershaw from Independent Sector, the public policy director, there is also available once we get to the Q&A to maybe answer some questions from independent sector's standpoint. But for now, I will turn it over to Sophia to kind of do a deeper dive into the bill. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you to all of you. This is really, really exciting to be addressing a group this large, full of so many leaders in our state in this sector. So just thank you all for being here and for taking the time. I thought to begin with, I would go over kind of the three entities that Congresswoman McCollum mentioned in her speech that this bill would establish, and then kind of get into a couple of the other details that we're really excited about. And then we can kind of take some questions. So the first entity that this bill would establish is the White House Office on Nonprofit Sector Partnership. And so this office would be, within the executive office of the president, headed by a nonprofit advisor who also serves as an assistant to the president. The office, the purpose of the office would be to make recommendations on federal policies that would strengthen the sector and its partnership with the government. This office would also coordinate with an annual release of existing data about nonprofits collected by other federal agencies, and would work to improve federal grant processes for nonprofits. This office would also kind of initiate a grant process to establish an online portal such that charities could register for fundraising opportunities across states at one time, which I know is a huge thing, especially for our smaller nonprofits. A lot of the code that was established to kind of regulate this area of donation was done before internet fundraising even existed. So that's one aspect that we're really excited about. This office would also direct the development of, like I said, the multi-state portal, and that it would be evaluated based on eliminating some of those inefficiencies that, a lot of nonprofit organizations run into in this process. And this office would also establish a federal grant program to offer recommendations to improve the operational relationship between all levels of government and the nonprofit sector. I think, there's certainly improvements to be made, beyond just the federal level as well. So the next kind of entity that I'm going to talk about is the Interagency Council on the nonprofit sector, on nonprofit sector partnership. So the Interagency Council would be comprised of representatives from every cabinet agency, as well as the Corporation for National and Community Service, the NCS, the National Endowment for the Humanities, National Endowment for the Arts, the National Science Foundation, and the Institute of Museum and Library Sciences. The Interagency Council would meet 4 times a year and release biennial reports providing policy recommendations about how the nonprofit sector can best leverage federal investments, really making sure that those federal dollars are being used as far and as wide as they can, which I know is a strength that the sector really, that's an area where this sector really shines. But there's no reason that we can't have a little bit more of a partnership there as well. And this third entity is the advisory board on the nonprofit sector. So the advisory board would be comprised of 8 presidential appointees, including the nonprofit advisor, and 8 congressional appointees, 2 from each Speaker of the House, and the House Minority Leader, Senate Majority Leader, and the Senate Minority Leader. So we really did that in the spirit of bipartisanship. We want to make sure that, with changes in administration, we're not going to be having kind of a yo-yo effect with some of these policy decisions, and also just to make this a little bit more palatable and make it something that Republicans can be excited about as well. So these board members are going to be drawn from the sector, just as the Congresswoman said, and reflect a diversity of organizational type and size. And so this kind of also helps answer that first question where, I think that we did a great job in this legislation of emphasizing diversity. And we mean that in size and scope. We mean that in communities served. We mean racial and ethnic minorities. We mean other minorities, LGBTQ. We want to make sure that women and men are represented equally. And so that was one area that we were really proud to kind of, make that a very serious point in this legislation. This board will be co-chaired by the nonprofit advisor and one other member who may not be from the same political party. So again, we really took the time to emphasize, bipartisanship and nonpartisanship wherever possible. A couple of the things that this bill does, it incentivizes and kind of facilitates more volunteerism and charitable giving. So there's a section in this bill that directs the U.S. Treasury Department to issue analyses of how relevant legislation and regulation would impact charitable giving, and to consider kind of reconstituting the IRS Advisory Committee on tax-exempt and government entities. We also have some great things in here with the Bureau of Labor Statistics to kind of issue, again, a biennial report on trends in the non-stipend volunteer force. This is data that we don't have readily available and that we absolutely need in order to accurately legislate. This bill also would direct the CNCS, the Corporation for National Community Service, to issue a report analyzing how it can best support national service and non-stipend volunteerism. And kind of, continuing on in the government research and data field here, we have a section of the bill that directs the Treasury Department to make recommendations on enhancing the way grants, contract, and reimbursement funds are recorded on nonprofits, annual information returns. So this bill directs the Department of the Treasury to rescind and replace the 1023 Easy application. There has been a lot of issues with this application, and we just want to kind of hit the pause button on that and kind of ask the Bureau of Labor Statistics to come back and kind of recalibrate this form so that it is going to be running a little bit smoother, is going to be producing accurate data and making sure that people that need to be classified for tax exemption are being classified as so. Then this bill also directs the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, to work with agencies to gather and disaggregate existing data on the nonprofit sector. So this data piece is really important because this is something that we do for the private sector quarterly. They get this data quarterly, they get it for free. With the nonprofit sector, as you all know, it's once every 5 years. And so it's just really hard to accurately legislate when we're not working with the most up-to-date data. And I imagine that this sort of data collection could be useful in such a wide range of uses. And so, those are just some of the highlights that we're really excited about. And Ben, please feel free to jump in if you're feeling that I'm missing anything super important. But otherwise, I see we have a few questions in the chat. I'm not sure how we want to run the question and answer portion, but I'm happy to turn it over to our hosts or however it works.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sophia, for that really helpful walkthrough. And it's great to see all the thoughtfulness that went into this bill, thinking about reporting and data and also just representation and diversity. So thank you for your hard work. So we will take questions in the chat if folks want to put their questions in the chat, and then I'll try to go through them and make sure they're asked. I think the first one was just about if there's a Senate companion, and then if not, if there's anything that the folks on the call may be able to do to help encourage that.
Yes, so that's a great question. We do not currently have a Senate companion. However, I know our friends at Independent Sector have kind of been having some really positive conversations with a few senators. So there is interest, but we have not formally introduced.
Thanks, that's helpful. And then it looks like there's a question about if you've talked with others in the Minnesota delegation and kind of how they stand, or what kind of questions they may have about the bill.
Sure. So currently, I'll just say that the two co-sponsors that we have on the bill are Representative McCollum and Representative Upton, the two who introduced. So I have, had really informal conversations with some of our, particularly on the Dem side of the Minnesota delegation, and they're very excited about the bill. What we are also trying to do, which adds just the slightest hurdle, is when we're adding co-sponsors, we want to, we kind of call it the Noah's Ark method, where we want to be adding a Republican and a Dem together for as long as we can, just again, really in the spirit of bipartisanship. So, none of them have officially been added to the bill, but there is interest as well.
That's great. And that was our impression when we talked about it a little bit at Foundations on the Hill with the Minnesota delegation. And yeah,
Right.
There seemed to be a lot of interest and some questions. There's a question here about is there a dollar amount attached to the bill? I know that was a question we did here at Foundations on the Hill, just what it costs and staffing, that sort of stuff.
Absolutely. So all of this can be done for the low price of 50 million in FY23. And we're kind of imagining that such sums may be necessary in 2024 through 2027 if we get our way, which I know kind of can sound like a lot of money, but it really isn't. It's not too much to ask. I don't think that the dollar amount should be too prohibitive for getting people to co-sponsor.
That's great. Thank you. I'm curious if how nonprofits and foundations can support this legislation, if you have any advice for all of us.
Absolutely. And Ben may be able to join in here as well, because independent sector has been kind of running this part of the operation for us, but there is a great area on their website where you can actually sign on as an official endorser of the bill. So I'm sure we can circulate that link, either in the chat or when we're through. So that is an excellent way to get involved. We're also encouraging people, of course, to talk to their member of Congress and make sure that they know that there are organizations within their district that support this legislation. Oh, and I see Ben just put the link in there. We're really excited because we have, I think, gosh, last time I checked, we had, Ben, is it over 500 endorsing organizations and counting, and we have all 50 states covered. So it's really exciting. We're gaining a lot of steam, and we're looking to add more. So please, if you feel so inclined, please do add yourself as an endorsing org.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, thanks, Sophia. I mean, I would just foot stomp what you said, and what Katina alluded to earlier was that the interest we have seen from Senate offices and from other House offices, a lot of it was seeded when this legislation happened to be on the agenda for a major event where people were talking to all their legislators about it. I mean, that's no accident. So the best way to generate more leads and more co-sponsors and more momentum is for folks to raise this. Yes, getting on the endorsement letter is valuable, but legislators, and Sophia could speak to this better than I could, they understand the difference between your organization's name on paper and actually hearing from your organization that this is a priority for you. So lots of chance to make headway within the Minnesota delegation or otherwise.
I think that's a great point. If you have upcoming meetings with members of the congressional delegation or their staff, considering adding this to your agenda, it's a great piece of advice. There are a couple. Oh, go ahead.
I was just, I don't need to recite the chat, but Marie Ellis noted that this is also, speaking of Hill Days, right? This is on the National Council of Nonprofits upcoming Hill Day. NCN was an instrumental partner in this effort with the McCollum office, long back before Sophia and I were involved. And they're a critical partner this time around as well. Really instrumental in development and in this next step as well, along with the foundation community too.
That's great to hear that it's on that agenda as well. I know, United Philanthropy Forum, in partnership with Independent Sector and Council on Foundations, had it on that foundation side of the agenda too. So it seems like a very unifying issue across our sector. There are a couple of questions just about kind of the likelihood that this would become law or the timeline. Do you have a sense of, is this possible in this Congress or is it a longer time horizon?
That's a great question. So, all good things take time, of course. This is, I don't know, also just for the history of the group. So my boss actually introduced a very similar bill back in 2010. And, unfortunately, it wasn't able to pass the House. But it was, independent sector and NCN kind of, we decided to reinvigorate the conversation because we saw, the fallout of COVID and how that worked for the sector and how it didn't work for the sector in a lot of ways. And so this has been a long time coming, is my point. And, we're still very hopeful. We would still like to see this, I think it's likely, if it's going to be passing, it's going to be tacked on to a larger package. Ideally, we would pass it under suspension, which is kind of a drama-free way to pass something through the House. But we're also prepared to kind of renew the effort again next year if that's what we need to do. But we're really pushing for passage this year.
That's great to hear. And yeah, we'll obviously be hopeful that it can be added into something maybe later in the year. That's really exciting. So there are a couple questions about kind of pushback or objections that you've heard. One question around, are you hearing any pushback about, if nonprofits should have a seat at the table, like if they should have a seat at like the Small Business Administration instead of the White House, or another objections about some silly objections on media accounts, and just generally like what kind of pushback have you been hearing, and how have you been responding to it?
Sure. And I mean, just kind of addressing the Small Business Administration versus, the White House versus, other options. So the Small Business Administration is kind of within the Department of Treasury. And the idea here is particularly with the Interagency Council, there would be representation from that entity that would have a direct role in this, kind of legislative work. And to me, it's better because, the nonprofit sector is so wide ranging. I mean, it's everything from healthcare to environmentalism to housing to labor. There's no kind of neat box that you can put the sector in. And that's what's so great about it. But that's also what makes it kind of complicated. And, Small Business Administration, they do really wonderful work for small business. And that was kind of one of our inspiration points where, we saw in the pandemic how SBA was able to react very quickly and provide aid to small businesses without too much trouble. I mean, the first round of PPP was a little messy, but ultimately they were able to mobilize pretty quickly. But then, they were kind of stuck out there with nonprofits. They knew that they had to be included in some way, but they had to make these regulations and decisions about an industry that they really didn't know all that much about. And I'm not trying to speak, poorly of the SBA. They did the best that they could do in a tough situation. But, it really behooves us all to have experts from the sector as well as representation from, all areas of government, because the sector really does touch all areas of government.
That's a super helpful response. And I think we've felt that on the ground as well, just even at the state level, hearing, a lot of the programs in Minnesota were really designed for small businesses as well, and maybe included nonprofits, but not always having thought through it super well. So
right. I know
really
people were having to fill out forms where it's like, who is your owner? It's like, no one owns this, how do we this is not a time to be having silly mistakes on forms. These were dire circumstances, and it was a little messy. I will say that. So yeah, that's the hope. We can avoid that next time.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there other kind of pushback or objections? And I don't know, Ben, if you've heard it from others as well, but just curious if there are other kind of items that you're having to think through or think about.
Yeah, I mean, Christina, I think, what David, rightly alluded to some of the silly, pushback about, well, do we partnerships between nonprofits and government, is that even necessarily a good thing? Which is, a pretty esoteric question. It is a reality. Whether you like it or not, if someone had concerns about that, the federal government couldn't be run without nonprofits delivering much of the work of the federal government. And when that pushback comes up, I think one thing that we often emphasize is that without the nonprofit sector's partnership, you would have many more federal employees and many larger federal programs delivering, trying to deliver the same services in a less efficient way. I think that's something that resonates, particularly with people who raise that, who have raised, kind of that, I wouldn't even call it a concern, right? That question. We also have some pretty cool, it's a little bit dated polling showing that over 70% of Americans think that the federal government could do a better job of serving communities if there were structures in place for this coordination.
That's really helpful. Thank you. And yeah, just to understand that that concern, but also the reality that nonprofits and government do partner closely, really at every level. There are a couple of questions related to the advisory board, one around kind of how they'll be selected, have they already been selected, but also there was a question earlier about is it like a paid board role, or just kind of how it works in maybe a little bit more detail and some of that selection piece.
So I can start by saying the board has absolutely not been selected yet. We're wide open when it comes to that. So I think that there is a legitimate chance. I see the question of, someone on this call being a part of that, pool that we're choosing from. And then I'm sorry, can you refresh my memory? Is this a paid position? I know we went back and forth a few times about, kind of the logistics of this part.
Yeah, we did, and it was feedback, as I remember it, strongly from the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits, saying that there's a major equity reason why people who serve on committees like this ought to be paid for their time. So the bill includes a provision that designates anyone who's serving on this board while they're on the board, for the days in which they serve, they're designated a special government employee and paid for their time. It's not, it's a few days, it's not a whole heck of a lot of money, which is why it can all be had for such a small federal appropriation. But yes, people will be paid while they are in active service on the board.
That's great. Thanks for that. And I think I see Marie put a comment. Yes, we're happy with that. Thank you for giving that feedback, MCN. Let's see, there's another question about, is there a recommendation process, or would there be a recommendation process for that board, or kind of how do you get in the pipeline to be part of that if this does pass?
That's another great question. I don't know that we've established a formal process at this point, but I love the enthusiasm. And, obviously, as soon as we, I think, again, it'll be about getting the bill passed before we kind of come up with these other details. But we'll be sure to make sure that is very transparent, and that, all of our leaders in the industry are made aware. So.
Thank you. So I'm curious what kind of questions you may be getting from other members of Congress or their staff, where, obviously you're hearing a lot of questions from us today as we work to understand and just really are grateful for the proposal. But yeah, curious what kind of questions you are getting from other members of Congress who might be considering joining this bill or not.
I think one question that we have gotten several times, and we've gotten it today, is about, making sure that the entire scope of the sector is included. I know, some of the larger nonprofits that exist, they kind of already have a seat at the table in some ways. And so this bill is about kind of bringing in some equity to that, and also making sure that we're including nonprofits from the faith community. We're including nonprofits that serve very, very specific populations. We're including nonprofits that, service underserved or minority communities. And I think that that's been a real, question for a lot of people, and something that, I feel very comfortable saying that we've addressed pretty thoroughly in the legislation. But I'd say that's probably my number one question so far. And you'll notice, we kind of went over this with another group earlier in the week, but there is no list of nonprofits or types of nonprofits that will be included in this bill. And that's by design. By not having a list, we're not leaving anyone out, but we are laying out parameters that try to bring in as many, types of nonprofits and foundations from the sector as possible. So that's kind of been one of the main points that I've been getting on the Hill. Also, the price tag. People always want to know, how much this is going to cost, which is a totally valid, question, and one again that I feel happy to answer at 50 million. But Ben, I don't know if there have been other questions that have kind of come up on your end.
I think that when I was working on Capitol Hill, the number one thing I wanted to know about a bill I was starting to wrap my head around was who supports this, and how much do they support it. And in our conversations with staff, that's the number one question we've been getting. So to the point Justin just put in the chat, getting names on that endorsement letter is a great way to help. And we can share that link again, or I know I can share it in the follow-up notes as well. So that's one. I think that's a key question. We've also gotten, I think there are individual provisions of this that, other than Sophia, there are some Capitol Hill staffers who don't understand what a Form 1023 EZ is, right? And they don't understand that there's a massive error rate with that form. And well, why would you get rid of a form that people are using to get access to, to becoming a charity? So I think there's some substantive things that come up, and that's our job as advocates to answer the questions we can, and to find answers to the questions we don't know off the top of our head.
Yeah, thank you. I think that just the few questions that we heard when we were talking about it, that aligns very closely with some of the questions we heard too. It's like there's a question from Kristen. Would any part of the work of the advisory board be to share recommended best practices and guidelines to states? For example, she's thinking about the low admin fees provided to nonprofit intermediaries that often result in added cost burden to organizations. There are probably a lot of other examples. So kind of, would there be opportunities for states to maybe learn from this and offer some best practices to states in their grant making practices?
Yes, I mean, that's why we want this advisory board to be comprised of leaders from the sector, because you guys know what has been working best, what hasn't been working, particularly in states like Minnesota, where we have such a strong state organization. Yes, this is exactly the type of thing that we would want the advisory board to be kind of contributing on.
Great. I'm curious, just knowing like independent sector, and there are obviously some other national organizations that represent the sector, kind of how they may interact with that advisory board. Would you anticipate that they would be represented on the advisory board, or more kind of informal partners to that advisory board? I don't know if that's been thought through, but I'm just curious, knowing that we all often look to our national counterparts, to hear about what's going on at the federal level.
Katina, I think that's a great question. I think the legislative language says that there ought to be people serving on this council who this advisory board, who look out for the whole sector and who represent all the diversity that Sophia talked about, geographic, racial, ethnic communities served. So I don't think there's any, it doesn't read to me like there's any decision made in the bill about that. I think as Sophia alluded to earlier, there are organizations in the nonprofit sector who, know who to call in the White House when they have a question. And those of us who work on nonprofit policy at the federal level, I would count us among that list. So we're not, I think organizations like us are not the intended people to be on this board in terms of lifting up the voices that need to be heard.
Yeah, that's helpful insight. I was just curious. Didn't necessarily have an opinion either way, but was curious to know. There's a question about maybe talking a little bit more about the national service piece. Curious if you want to expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, so this bill does a couple of things to kind of bolster volunteerism and charitable giving, and the national service. So one thing that it does is directs CNCS, Corporation for National and Community Service, to kind of, as I said before, issue a report analyzing how it can best support national service and non-stipend volunteerism. And it also directs CNCS to solicit public input on current population survey supplements of relevance for the nonprofit sector. So that's kind of one area where this bill kind of makes some changes and improvements. But also in Section 8 of the bill, there's language that directs CNCS to make recommendations to Congress on how to broaden access to national service for underserved communities. And it also directs CNCS to kind of redesign its online application system and to test by engaging organizations that are not current grantees. So again, just kind of opening up the door a little wider for organizations and for folks who haven't been engaged with it before.
That's great. I have a question about you had mentioned that part of the research would be as bills are introduced, if they would have an impact on charitable giving and maybe on volunteering as well. I can't remember. There would be kind of the equivalent maybe of a fiscal note or something like that. I'd love to learn more about how that might work. Would that be specific to kind of tax policy changes or broader than that as well?
Sure, and I mean, we do this already in a lot of ways. We always are checking with the Congressional Budget Office of, okay, what's the bottom line? How is this going to affect the deficit? And so there are, kind of mechanisms in place where we do this already. And so there's no reason that this shouldn't also be a part of the legislative process. And so this would come from the Department of the Treasury and kind of through the IRS as well. And so that's, one piece. Again, I believe it's in Section 7 of the bill if you want to, if anyone's reading along at home. But that is one area where we feel like, this arguably should have been happening long ago, and something that, could be a relatively, I don't want to say easy because nothing is ever easy at the federal level, but it could be a simpler, way to just know what the impact is going to be of some of this legislation. A lot of legislation is put forward with the best intentions, and then it just, has all these kind of unintended consequences. So this is one area where we can really prevent against that.
I think that's great. I know many of us looked at the 2017 tax reform and felt like there were potentially negative consequences just by raising the standard deduction on charitable giving. So I think it's great to really call attention to that. I see a question about if, going back to the national service piece, if there's anything in the bill around increasing stipends for those that are employed at a nonprofit partnering on national service. I know sometimes, I don't know if it's consistent across groups, but I think it's on the low side. If there's anything in the bill related to that, or if that maybe would be a recommendation that would come out of one of the entities.
Yes. I think exactly right. This would be kind of one of the recommendations. It's not explicitly written in the bill, but could be a great, I don't want to say consequence, because that sounds negative, but could be a great, kind of waterfall effect.
That's great. We do have a question, and I don't know if you'll know the answer to this one because there's so many different departments, but if you have a sense of the current amount of federal funding used to deliver services through nonprofits.
That's a great question. And it's really illustrative of why we need this bill, because no, I don't. Off the top of my head, there are several kind of areas off the top of my head that I could pull from, but we don't have any of that all in one place. And they're again, because the sector is so wide reaching, there is money coming from all these little kind of different dripping faucets of federal dollars, and we don't really have a general idea of how much money we're currently funneling into the sector. I know it needs to be more, but
right, not to pile on the federal government too much here, Katina, but that's one of the things that this bill fixes, right? Because grants and contributions are recorded in a way and reported in a way on the 990 where it's impossible for researchers to tell whether money is coming from a contribution from a private source or a contribution from a government source. It's not reported in the right way. So you've got apples lumped with oranges on the 990, and these are basic questions about our sector that we can't answer right now.
I think that's a really great point. And yeah, certainly that information I think would be helpful as people understand kind of the scope and responsibility that the nonprofit sector holds within government. So I'm going to ask one more question and then I'll turn it over to Nanoko to close us out. But I know are really interested in civic engagement, and we're really involved in census and in other, voter education, things like that. I know there's a section related to nonpartisan civic engagement in this bill. Could you maybe share a little bit more about that and kind of what the bill may do in that area?
So I just want to make sure I'm understanding your question correctly. And I'm sorry, I'm reading it in the chat as well. Is this related to like components within the Census Bureau? Because we don't currently have any involvement with the Census Bureau, I believe, at this point. But what we do have is, some data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And this is also to get people engaged with, the volunteer force that maybe hadn't been engaged before, but also just to kind of get an idea of what this labor force looks like. And there's also language that pushes for quarterly economic data from BLS, as it does for the for-profit. So I'm not sure if I'm accurately answering your question. I want to make sure I'm understanding correctly, but.
Yeah, yes, thanks for that clarification. So it was actually, I think, a private question chatted to me, but in section 10 of the bill, there's something around clarifying the prohibition on political campaign intervention by charitable organizations. So maybe making it more clear how nonprofits can do civic engagement work and where some of the fuzzy lines are.
Yes, I'm sorry, I'm with you now. So this would be section 10 of the bill. And so this section directs the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, to issue a report identifying opportunities to clarify the prohibition on political campaign intervention by charitable nonprofits. We know this can be really murky water, and it's difficult to understand by design. And then this language also encourages GAO to analyze the applicable standard for other nonprofit organizations. So hopefully be able to clear that up a little bit and make sure that everybody is, operating above board and engaging politically where it makes sense and where it is, legal for them.
Absolutely. Thanks for that clarification. And I think certainly, I know MCN and MCF have done, a number of education sessions with our members about kind of advocacy do's and don'ts, but I do think it's great to have, more reports and more information on that for folks to feel comfortable engaging in advocacy and civic engagement. Well, with that, I just want to say thanks so much, Sophia and Ben, and I will turn it over to Nanoko to close us out.
And also thank you, Katina and Sophia and Ben as well for your time and being here with us today. I think, discussions around equity and making sure that we are centering the needs of nonprofits who are small and on the ground and do not have resources. I think those conversations are really vital. So we'll continue to push on that from our end. In the meantime, I want to recognize that we have so many folks here today from across the country. We just wanted to say thank you for being here. Thank you for learning about this important legislation. Thank you to Betty McCollum, Representative Betty McCollum, for your time in speaking with us today. If you have any further questions, obviously we are here in the Minnesota, and just wanted to say thank you and have a great rest of your afternoon.